Well, I'm kind of guessing that most of us here today woke up in very comfortable beds with very few important decisions to make. Among my biggest decisions this morning was finalizing which of my 5 shirts and blazers I should wear. Now, my next big decision was how to get here, subway or Uber. That really didn't matter to me because I don't live too far, but I took out a coin and I flipped it. I decided to make a decision based on which way the coin fell. Heads or tails, easy way to make a decision, right? Well, I got here. Now, as I stand here on this stage, recognizing what a privilege it is for me to have been chosen to share my story and my ideas with you, I am wildly aware that my day bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to that of so many desperately tormented people right here in this very city and in hundreds, if not thousands of places across North America and abroad. The fact is that someone, somewhere, at this very moment, is standing at a threshold extremely different than the one I just crossed. Their decisions and choices will have nothing to do with the pace they use to get to center stage or how to stress a key point in their talk. No, their decision will involve a profoundly different and major choice, and that is, do I or do I not join the ranks of terrorism today and fight for a cause I may or may not believe in? Imagine having that to contemplate over your morning coffee. And their decision, my friends, won't be based on which way the coin flips. And here, in this very city, a child ran away from home after being repeatedly abused. You know the kind of abuse I'm talking about. Sexually, emotionally, and physically. And they ran away because they felt that there was no other option available to them. And that young person, and this happens so often, that young person is standing at a crossroad of their own, tired and hungry, deciding whether or not to jump into a minivan that just pulled up and accept a man's offer of $20 to perform a sexual act that up until now had been forcibly taken from them. And you know what? In most cases, they always do. Because as tired, hungry, and desperate as they are, with no other place to go, he or she still needs to survive. I was raised in a home that required me to depend on myself at a young age. My father was a violent alcoholic who often took out his physical rage on my mother's siblings and I. For as far back as I could remember, I felt defenseless to protect myself and my family from him. And at the age of about 7, I decided that when I grew up, I was going to become a policeman so I could arrest people like my father. But my father never gave me a chance to arrest him. He killed himself when I was 17. Now, for months following his suicide, I searched for answers to try to make sense of it all. I wanted to understand what could possibly drive a person to commit such a desperate, violent, and final act, when in my naive mind at the time, I always thought that despite whatever circumstances one was faced with, we always had better options to choose from, right? I made it a personal mission to try to find out. I joined the police at 21 and transferred into the detective office 6 years later. Now there, I discovered 2 valuable lessons that I carried with me throughout my career. The first one was dropping all judgment of people at the door, where it belonged. And the second one was that when I treated each suspect that I encountered with dignity and respect, while reminding them that there was still some good in them despite what they had done, they were more likely to cooperate with me and confess their crimes. And that approach worked extremely well for me. I discovered that I could get more from a victim, witness, and suspect when I used honey instead of vinegar. After working for years as a detective, a hostage negotiator, and a police instructor, I applied for the position of a peacekeeper in the Middle East to train Iraqi police cadets in human rights and criminal investigations. I'd be lying to you if I stood here and told you that the thought of going down to the Middle East during the Iraqi war didn't scare the hell out of me. but I felt that I was being called to do something that was actually bigger than myself. And when I found out that I actually got chosen to go, I felt like a little schoolboy on his very first date. I think some of you can relate, all the emotions that are going through you at the time. But I also felt conflicted because I knew the decision I had made meant that I would be leaving my family for several months with the understanding that I may never come back. But the thought of doing my part in the war against terrorism outweighed my fears, and with the blessing of my family, I flew to Jordan in 2005, where I became a peacekeeper and an instructor at the Jordanian International Police Training Center. Every 2 weeks, I would welcome a class of between 45 and 55 Iraqi cadets by first telling them what an honor it was for me to be there to share my knowledge with them, and also how much I looked forward to learning from them. Now imagine this. These cadets ranged in ages between 16, that's right, 16 and 60. Some of them were university graduates, whereas others had never learned how to read or write or even spent a day in school. Some of them were there by choice, others out of desperation, and some of them had no clue how they had come to be there in the first place. The sad truth is that many of these men were being sent to us suffering from mental illness, depressed and suicidal already. There was no way of conducting background checks on all these men. Iraq was in desperate need of police officers. We got about 3,000 of them every 8 weeks. We got taxi drivers, coffee runners, criminals, Sunnis, Shiites, and as it turns out, we got an awful lot of terrorists who had managed to infiltrate the academy quite undetected, simply by signing up, wearing a police uniform, and later collecting a paycheck. A typical class was a mix of all these men. Now, considering the diversity, the vulnerability, the fear, and the obvious walls that needed to be broken down, I wanted to create a learning environment in my classroom that was breakthrough and meaningful. One of the ways I decided to accomplish this was by using something that I had become very passionate about: acting. I figured that if I could get my cadets to role play the various lessons that I had taught them, whether it was how to lawfully arrest somebody or how to collect evidence, that the lessons were more likely to stick, especially through role play and especially for the ones who had never had an education before. And I also knew that most of the men in my classroom were homesick. They were frightened. Some of them had no idea whether they were going to live 6 weeks after they left the academy. I knew this, and I wanted to make their experience in my classroom that much better. So I came up with an idea. I decided to end each of our 8-hour days together with song and stories. What I'd do, I'd take about 30 minutes at the end of every day, and I would invite the cadets to sing and tell stories about their lives and their families. Now, a lot of these men did not have television back home. They didn't have the internet, and singing and telling stories was a way that they enjoyed spending time with their family. So they had a great time doing this. This is a highlight of our day. Now imagine this. I had Sunnis, Shiites, and the odd terrorist in my classroom. That's right. Sitting side by side, laughing, singing, and telling stories. I made them forget about the war. I made them forget about the hatred they had for one another, and I made them feel like little kids again. The trust I built in my classroom tore down all the walls that had once separated us and made them disappear. Now that April, I transferred into the Advocacy and Counseling Division, and once I had arrived, I was approached by a cadet who warned me of a rumored attack on the academy. I alerted our security immediately, and we went about business as usual. As it turns out, for days, insurgent cadets and their followers had been secretly collecting weapons for the assault. And a few days after the warning, I was walking through a small stretch of desert at sunrise with my good friend and partner, Yarmo. We were walking to our advocacy building, when we found ourselves surrounded by 40 of these angry, armed insurgent cadets. With no security in sight and no exit available to me, I kind of thought that my day had taken a turn for the absolute worst. And one of the only thoughts going through my fear-riddled mind was whether or not I was going to get to see my daughters again. I honestly thought this was my day to go. Now, the mob reached in, and I was not armed, but I knew one thing, that despite the fact that I wasn't armed, I was going to fight with everything that I had because I, too, wanted to survive. So they reach in and they grab us. And as I begin to fight the fight of my life, I hear one of the men in that crowd, those 40 guys, yelling my name, Mr. Paul, Mr. Paul. He started shouting other things in Arabic, but without my wonderful Jordanian language assistants at my side, I had no idea what was being said. I was just fighting, you know? And almost as suddenly as they had grabbed us, they released us. And the circle then parted. Now, when I was finally able to focus and my adrenaline came down just a little bit, I searched for the face of the man who had shouted my name and put a stop to that attack. And I recognized him. He was one of my former students. And he had the biggest grin on his face when he walked up towards me. And when he got to me, he simply put his hand on my shoulder, pointed towards our building. The smile never left him. And he said, "Go, Mr. Paul, go." And Yadamo and I escaped unscathed. Now, when I think back to our safe passage that day, I honestly attribute it to the way in which I had treated each of my students with dignity and respect, and to the bonds that we were able to forge in my classroom through our mutual experiences together. And despite the fact that that cadet, the one who had shouted my name, had slipped into the darkness of terrorism that day, plotting the beating and or death of internationals, humanity still lived in him, and he decided to set us free. When I think of some of the decisions that we make here back at home, we're often encouraged to believe that the rewards will outweigh the risks. But that is not always the reality, and it certainly isn't the reality for many people in the Middle East. I want you to try to put yourself into the shoes of the next young cadet I tell you about. He had just arrived at the academy about a week before coming to see me. He was 30 years old, married with 3 children. His youngest was an infant, and his parents lived with him. Now, he was their sole provider, and the only means of income that he had was selling coffee at a small stand in his village. So needless to say, they weren't doing all that well. Now, the academy in which I worked at offered good wages for 8 weeks training, enough to feed this man's family for about 6 months, so he decides that he's going to join. After he made his announcement public, he was approached by another man who offered him a different way to provide for his family. That man offered to feed, clothe, and shelter this cadet's entire family forever. He also promised that the cadet's children would have a good school to go to, and that he himself, the cadet, would have his picture hung on a wall of honor somewhere. And all he had to do to get these wonderful riches was join the man's jihad, strap on a suicide vest, and complete one mission. For days following that offer, terrorists dropped warnings outside this man's home, advising him that he had better take them up on their offer or suffer the consequences. Well, guess what? He didn't. He came to the academy, and now, a week after arriving at the academy, he was sitting in my office because he couldn't reach his family for a once-a-week, 10-minute telephone call to them. I wish I could tell you that the story ends well for this cadet, but I can't. Following my investigation, I was the bearer of devastating and heartbreaking news when I informed this man that his entire family, including his infant child, had been slaughtered, executed by the very terrorists who just a few weeks earlier had promised to take care of them forever. Why? Because he said no to terrorism and no to becoming a suicide bomber. Now that same recruiter will follow and find another young man, and he will provide that man with the same offer he gave my cadet. And he will use this horrific story to intimidate the next young man into saying yes. And the cadet who said no to terrorism, no to becoming a suicide bomber, will have to live with the consequences of his decision forever. Now, by sharing these stories with you, I am not suggesting that we feel sorry for all terrorists, or to believe that each and every terrorist is forced by circumstances to do what they do, or even to believe that there is humanity within terrorism. Because the truth is that the paralyzing ideologies and religious fanaticism in so many deeply rooted and committed terrorists are so bleak, so cruel, and so irrational that it is unimaginable to find humanity within terrorism as a whole. What I am suggesting for us to do is not to look at it or any other unimaginable decision or problem for that matter as a whole. Whether it's terrorism or criminal behavior, let's pick the act or circumstance apart first for the purpose of conducting our own investigation into what may have led the individual to choose the path they chose. What may often lure a person to become a terrorist or to choose a life of crime, homelessness, or addiction is not always as clear as we may think. And despite the choices that one makes, I believe that humankind has the inherent capacity for virtue. If it weren't so, we would have destroyed each other a long time ago. Yes, terrorism, the act, is horrendous, but if we remove the act for just a moment for the purpose of examining how the decision was made to join, and if we then examine the very core of the decision maker, we would find that we're not all that different. We all laugh, love, bleed, and cry in the same way. We were all born to the same earth, and we became part of the same race, the human race, and we're all motivated to survive. The message here is for us not to be so quick to judge or to hate, and to exercise our emotional training and inherent goodness to help us pull the very best out of those who have stepped away from the paths of righteousness, and to help them turn even their darkest of circumstances around. Let's dispel the belief that born bad is something that we or they are stuck with. We often fear that which we don't understand, or judge without having all the facts. Some of us may simply be uncomfortable with people who are different than us. Some of us judge another simply based on their skin color, or when their sexual preferences or religious beliefs don't match our own. And my question is, how is that lack of acceptance or openness to understanding any different than anyone else's anywhere? One of the sad truths is that we may in fact be contributing to the very hatred and terrorism that we repudiate. By failing to exercise the virtues that live in each and every one of us, those virtues of love, compassion, and understanding, dignity, respect, and accountability, by failing to treat each other the way that we would like to be treated ourselves and the way we would like to be treated in return, and by not holding our governments accountable to do the same, we may be nudging that undecided would-be terrorist standing on the sidelines watching our every move, deciding whether or not they want to become terrorists too. And terrorism is not exclusive to the Middle East. Is it not an act of terrorism when a heavily armed racist white man walks into a church of worshipers and opens fire on an innocent congregation? How is that any different than the horror that we see unleashed on so many innocents across the globe by radical terrorism? the undecided would-be terrorist standing at a threshold deserves a reminder and an example from us of humanity to imitate. If what he or she sees are people who are indifferent to their culture, their values, or their lifestyle, or people who are critical of another person's skin color, sexual orientation, or religious beliefs, what message is that impressionable young individual likely to adapt? So how do we go about finding humanity within terrorism, within the individual or would-be terrorists? Can terrorists and criminals be reached and hearts changed? Believing that they can and choosing to embody the humanity that I saw in each of my cadets is what saved my life in the Middle East. And I believe that if we each become these living examples of humanity, we will save and improve the lives of so many others as well. Let's take a very quick look at the flip side of that coin. What do we risk if we continue to see those who have stepped away from righteous paths as individuals without humanity? Or if we perpetuate the lack of humanity that we see in so many places across the globe? Here in Canada, we are fortunate to have our rights and freedoms protected, but for some in this very country, that's not always the case. Why are some of us so quick to judge and to jump to conclusions, or to avoid interaction with people who appear different than we are, to avoid it completely? Why are some of us so quick to turn away from popular media after hearing or seeing something that just cries out to us to say, enough is enough. We're better than this. We can make a difference. Why have our governments and lawmakers enacted laws that take away the rights of some groups only to give them to others? Wow. Let's step back, take another look, and ask ourselves, could a kind gesture or a warm hello or a sincere smile make a difference to the recipient and help them make a better choice? And my question to you is, what are you doing to make their lives more bearable? Thank you.